Welcome back to the adventures of Captain Underpants, Chapter 5. One day, very, very soon. Remember when I said that George and Harold's silly streak got them into big, big trouble once? Well, this is a story of how this happened, and how some huge pranks and a little blackmail turned their principal into the coolest superhero of all time. It was a day of the big football game between the Horwitz Knuckleheads and the Stubbornville Stinkbugs. The stands were packed with fans. The cheerleaders ran onto the field and shook their pom-poms over their heads. A fine black dust drifted out of their pom-poms and settled all around them. "Gimme a K!" shouted the cheerleaders. "K!" repeated the fans. "Gimme an N!" shouted the cheerleaders. "N!" repeated the fans. "Gimme an Achoo!" sneezed the cheerleaders. "Achoo!" repeated the fans. The cheerleaders sneezed and sneezed and sneezed some more. They couldn't stop sneezing. "Hey!" shouted a fan in the stands. "Somebody sprinkled black pepper into the cheerleaders' pom-poms. I wonder who did that?" asked another fan. The cheerleaders stumbled off the field, sneezing and dripping with mucus, as the marching band members took their places. But when the band began to play, steady streams of bubbles began blowing out of their instruments. Bubbles were everywhere. Up and down the field the marching band slipped and slid, leaving behind a thick trail of wet, bubbly foam. "Hey!" shouted a fan in the stands. "Somebody poured bubble bath into the marching band's instruments. I wonder who did that?" asked another fan. Soon the football teams took to the fields. The knuckleheads kicked the ball. Up, up, up went the ball. Higher and higher it went. The ball sailed into the clouds and kept right on going until nobody could see it any more. "Hey!" shouted a fan in the stands. "Somebody filled the game ball with helium. I wonder who did that?" asked another fan. But the missing ball didn't make any difference, because at that moment the knuckleheads were rolling around the field, scratching and itching like crazy. "Hey!" shouted the coach. "Somebody replaced our deep heating muscle rub lotion with Mr. Prankster's extra scratchy itching cream. We wonder who did that?" shouted the fans in the stands. The whole afternoon went on much the same way, with people shouting everything from "Hey! Somebody put sea monkeys in the lemonade!" to "Hey! Somebody glued all the bathroom doors shut!" But before long, most of the fans in the stands had left. The big game had been forfeited, and everyone in the entire school was miserable. Everyone, that is, except for two giggling boys crouching into the shadows beneath the stands. "Those were our best pranks yet," laughed Harold. "Yep," chuckled George. "They'll be hard to top, that's for sure." "I just hope we don't get busted for this," said Harold. "Don't worry," said George. "We've covered our tracks really well. There's no way we'll get busted." Chapter 6. Busted. The next day at school an announcement came over the loudspeakers. "George Beard and Harold Hutchins, please report to Principal Krupp's office at once." "Uh-oh," said Harold. "I don't like the sound of that." "Don't worry," said George. "They can't prove anything." George and Harold entered Principal Krupp's office and sat down on the chairs in front of his desk. The two boys had been in this office together countless times before, but this time was different. Mr. Krupp was smiling. As long as George and Harold had known Mr. Krupp, they had never, ever seen him smile. Mr. Krupp knew something. "I didn't see you boys at the big game yesterday," said Mr. Krupp. No," said George. "We weren't feeling well." Yeah, Harold stammered nervously. We went home." "Ah, that's too bad," said Principal Krupp. "You boys missed a good game." George and Harold quickly glanced at each other, gulped, and tried hard not to look guilty. "Lucky for you, I have a videotape of the whole thing," Mr. Krupp said. He turned on the television in the corner and pressed the play button on the VCR. A black and white image appeared on the TV screen. It was an overhead shot of George and Harold sprinkling pepper into the cheerleaders' pom-poms. Next came a shot of George and Harold pouring liquid bubble bath into the marching band's instruments. "How do you like the pre-game show?" asked Mr. Krupp with a devilish grin. George eyed the television screen in terror. He couldn't answer. Harold's eyes were glued to the floor. He couldn't look. The tape went on and on, revealing all of George and Harold's behind-the-scenes antics. By now, both boys were eyeing the floor, squirming nervously and dripping with sweat. Mr. Krupp turned off the TV. "You know," he said, "ever since you boys came to this school, it's been one prank after another. First you put dissected frogs in the salad at the parent-teacher banquet. Then you made it snow in the cafeteria. Then you rigged all the intercoms so they played Weird Al Yankovic songs full blast for 6 hours straight. For 4 long years, you two have been running amok in this school, and I've never been able to prove anything. Until now." Mr. Krupp held the videotape in his hand. "I took the liberty of installing tiny video surveillance cameras all around the school. I knew I'd catch you two in the act one day. I just didn't know it would be so easy." Chapter 7. A Little Blackmail. Mr. Krupp sat back in his chair and chuckled to himself for a long, long time. Finally George got up the courage to speak. What are you going to do with that tape?" he said. "I thought you'd never ask," laughed Principal Krupp. "I've thought long and hard about what to do with this tape," Mr. Krupp said. "At first I thought about sending copies to your parents." The boys swallowed hard and sank deeply into their chairs. "Then I thought I might send a copy to the school board," Mr. Krupp continued. "I could get you both expelled for this." The boys swallowed harder and sank deeper into their chairs. "Finally, I came to a decision," Mr. Krupp concluded. "I think the football team would be very curious to find out just who was responsible for yesterday's fiasco. I think I'll send a copy to them." George and Harold leapt out of their chairs and fell to their knees. "No!" cried George. "You can't do that! They'll kill us!" "Yeah!" begged Harold. "They'll kill us every day for the rest of our lives." Mr. Krupp laughed and laughed. "Please have mercy," the boys cried. "We'll do anything." "Anything?" asked Principal Krupp with delight. He reached into his desk, pulled out a list of demands, and tossed it at the boys. "If you don't want to be dead as long as you live, you'll follow these rules exactly." George and Harold carefully looked over the list. This is blackmail," said George. "Call it what you like," Principal Krupp snapped, "but if you two don't follow that list exactly, then this tape becomes the property of the Horwitz knuckleheads." Rules. Number 1. No more practical jokes or pranks. Number 2. No laughing or smiling. And the list went on and on. Chapter 8. Crime and Punishment. At 6 o'clock the next morning, George and Harold dragged themselves out of bed, walked over to Mr. Krupp's house and began washing his car. Then while Harold scrubbed the tyres, George roamed around the yard, pulling up all the weeds and nettles he could find. Afterwards they cleaned the gutters and washed all the windows on Mr. Krupp's house. At school, George and Harold sat up straight, listened carefully, and spoke only when spoken to. They didn't tell jokes. They didn't pull pranks. They didn't even smile. Their teacher kept pinching herself. "I just know this is a dream," she said. At lunch, the two boys vacuumed Mr. Krupp's office, shined his shoes, and polished his desktop. At break, they clipped his fingernails and ironed his tie. Each spare moment in the boys' daily schedule was spent catering to Mr. Krupp's every whim. After school, George and Harold mowed Mr. Krupp's lawn, tended his garden, and began painting the front of his house. At sunset, Mr. Krupp came outside and handed each boy a stack of books. "Gentlemen," he said, "I've asked your teachers to give you both extra homework. Now go home, study hard, and I'll see you back here at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. We've got a busy day ahead of us." "Thank you, sir," moaned the two boys. George and Harold walked home dead tired. "Man, this was the worst day of my entire life," said George. "Don't worry," said Harold. "We only have to do this for 8 more years. Then we can move away to some far-off land where they'll never find us. Maybe Antarctica." "I've got a better idea," said George. "Hey kids, it's a 3D hypno ring. Learn the art of hypnosis, amaze your friends, control your enemies, rule the world. It's easy, it's fun, only $2.99. He took a piece of paper out of his pocket and handed it to Harold. It was an old magazine ad for a 3D hypno ring. "How's this going to help us?" asked Harold. "All we gotta do is hypnotize Mr. Krupp," said George. "We'll make him give us the video and forget this whole mess ever happened." "That's a great idea," said Harold. "And the best part is we only have to wait 4 to 6 weeks for delivery." And that is the end of Chapter 8. Come back next time for Chapter 9.